Oh my God, this is so great. I am so grateful. Nithya was on her way home and she decided to stay for us. And so it is a great honor to introduce Nithya Ruff. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? Okay. So welcome to the Energy Summit, and it's wonderful to be here. I wear two hats, as Shuli indicated. My first hat is I run the open source program office at Comcast, which used to be a cable company, but now is at the intersection of communication, media, entertainment, technology. And I'll talk a little bit about the journey that we made. And I'm very, very honored and privileged to be elected chair of the Linux Foundation board earlier this year. And I'm happy to be here to represent the LF as well. A little bit about my journey. It was actually in 1998 that I discovered open source. I had never heard about open source before '98. So I was at Silicon Graphics, and our customers were telling us that we needed to move to open source-based products based on standards-based architecture like x86. And also we realized that it was cost-effective for us to start shipping more servers based on open source. And we started moving more and more of our servers to Linux. And as part of the strategy team, my job was to figure out how do we make money if we move to open source? How do we create support for our customers? How do we bridge the gap between what our proprietary systems used to have and what open source had in those days? So we started contributing to Linux so that Linux became as strong as IRIX, which was our proprietary operating system. My journey at SGI then took me to an ISV, or an independent software vendor called Tripwire, which is a security software company. And Tripwire was also anxiously trying to understand how does an ISV use open source in their business model, how do they work with community, how do they move and become part of big distributions like Red Hat's RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And so part of my job was to work with the product management team and the business management team and vendors like Red Hat to open source Linux, open source Tripwire, and then have it bundled with other distributions. That journey then took me to Wind River Systems. I know some of my colleagues from Wind River are here. I had the opportunity to run Wind River's embedded Linux distribution product line, which included a very different way of thinking. Embedded products are nothing but build systems and custom distributions that different device manufacturers can use to create their own custom Linux or custom Linux distribution. So this was a fantastic opportunity actually to work with Jeff Rowe and others in the industry to start the Yocto project, which then helped us get a common way to build embedded distributions across the industry, across SoC vendors, across different ISVs, and it's a huge part of what we do at Comcast, and I'll explain that as well. And that journey then took me to Western Digital or SanDisk, which is a storage hardware vendor. So you would think, what is a hardware vendor doing in open source? And we find that hardware needs to make sure that the software ecosystem is ready before it's launched in order to successfully be adopted by customers. If there is not a set of applications, or if the operating system does not have the drivers or the optimization for your hardware, it's very difficult for your hardware to be adopted. So I had the opportunity to start the first open source program office at Wind River Systems, which then allowed us to work across the company and across communities and with foundations like the Linux Foundation to move the hardware forward in a successful way. I've been working at the Linux Foundation on diversity issues, especially making sure that open source is open to everyone. And sustaining open source through inviting new members joining the organization. And my current role is to run the open source program office at Comcast. Open source has been a huge part of our journey to become a more software-oriented company, to really transform our customer experiences through the use of open source software. So everything from our set-top box, which uses Yocto, to our cloud, which works with CNCF, and for our content distribution network, as well as companies like DreamWorks, which is a part of Comcast, working with the Academy Software Foundation. We are a huge participant in the open source community. And I think I mentioned my role at the Linux Foundation. So just a very quick history of how corporations and industries have adopted Linux over the ages. In the 80s, Linux really was started by individuals, whether it's people like Richard Stallman, with the with GNU, as well as creating the GPL license. It really was the territory of hobbyists and individuals in the 80s. In the 90s, you start seeing companies like IBM, Sun, HP, as well as Silicon Graphics, Red Hat, VA Linux, starting to enter open source and starting to use open source, starting to ship open source-based products. And you also start seeing institutions like the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation, OSI, which is the Open Source Initiative, and other organizations and institutions start to come to being. This then really made it much more prolific, if you will, among industries and companies. The third major adoption started with cloud companies, hyperscale companies like Facebook and Google and others, really building their infrastructure and products based on open source. And the next phase around the 2010-2015 timeframe is businesses like us, Comcast or a Capital One or Bloomberg, people who you would not think as technology companies, starting to use open source to digitize, to get to market faster, to transform their customer experiences. And today you see LF Energy, the energy industry, you see the media and entertainment industry through the Academy Software Foundation start to adopt open source and realizing the lessons from before. And most of the corporate adoption that I have seen starts with ignoring that there is open source, and then goes to, it's an easy way for me to get to market faster or cheaper, so I'm going to start consuming what's out there. And then you start realizing that if I'm consuming, I need to comply with the licenses, and I need to make sure I'm using it correctly. And then you end up with, I think I cannot bear the burden of all the changes I've made. I need to contribute it back to open source. And also I need to give back if I'm taking. And then you end up in a leadership position where you are not only consuming and contributing, but you are creating open source projects of your own and releasing it to the world. And you are connecting with communities in a deep and meaningful way. So you find that a lot of companies start off as non-software companies, perhaps, like us. Of course, there are other proprietary software companies that start here, and through the transformation, they get deeper into open source engagement. Open source really has become one of the most successful enablers of global innovation in history. You will see time and time again industries moving to open source to speed their innovation. The communities that work with the open source projects at the Linux Foundation consistently push the foundation to helping transform their industry through collaboration. So I'll give you some examples. While the Linux Foundation started out with Linux as its core project, and at the time when Linux became the reason for founding the Linux Foundation, it was all about providing a neutral home for Linus Torvalds, who was the founder, the writer, the maintainer of Linux. It was to make sure that the legal framework was correct and that Linux was sustainable. You soon found that projects like the Yocto project, which is an embedded Linux distribution, and carrier-grade Linux started kind of saying, if it can work for Linux, it can work for us. Let's start using it in the embedded industry. Let's start using it in the carrier grade industry. And they started kind of expanding what the Linux Foundation could do. And soon you found that the networking space started using the same principles, the same framework, what worked for Linux and the embedded space. Why can't it work for the networking space and the telecom space? And then it also worked for various industries and technology segments, whether it is OpenNFV, which is all about integration and testing and APIs, to automotive-grade Linux, which started out as auto infotainment and then went all the way to actually the transmission systems and other parts of the car. And then the Cloud Native Foundation, Dan's here, which is all about cloud-native technologies, whether it's Kubernetes, Prometheus, et cetera, and interoperable clouds, to Let's Encrypt in the security space, and TARS, all about scaling. So you can see that the model started becoming more and more efficient and effective at working in other industries, and the templates could be used across industries. Soon you started seeing it even in standards and specifications areas. GraphQL is really about publishing open specifications that the ecosystem could use. The Open Container Initiative was also all about creating a consistent container specifications and also a reference implementation. And then the Joint Development Foundation is looking to really bridge the gap between open source and standards. And it has even come into the hardware space. We often talk about open source software, but open source hardware is becoming more and more a reality, whether it's through the Open Power Foundation or RISC-V or the CHIPS Alliance. Hardware is now being developed through the open source way. And now, of course, you have the LF energy and data being the new oil or platinum or whatever currency you want to think about, establishing practices and templates for data and how data will be licensed, how data will be shared is becoming extremely important, and of course, utilities and energy. So some of the common goals that I've seen as to why these projects are started and why they come to the LF is because the foundations, whether it's Linux Foundation, Apache, et cetera, provide a neutral home. Especially when companies are collaborating together, a lot of us may compete with each other. You need a neutral home to collaborate on things. The second reason is because every industry faces huge problems, and no one single company can solve these problems together alone. You need each other. And these are interconnected problems that we all face, and we need to work together to solve these big problems. The third reason is that we want these projects to live way beyond just our interest or our lifetime. We want these to be sustained and continue to move forward. The fourth reason is to disrupt the status quo. What's working now may not be the way to work in the future, and if you want to disrupt an industry, open source is the way to do it. And the last one is you want to work with an organization that has the expertise to work with you in creating an open source ecosystem and sustaining an open source ecosystem. And open source ecosystems require a lot of effort. And a lot of organizations, really have to work hard to recreate all this. Trust me, we have created a foundation as a company, and it takes a lot of work to sustain that, as opposed to going to a place which has done it again and again and again. And there are a number of foundations which have done it again and again and again. One of the things that the LF has done, it has covered all of the elements that one would need in order to create both a commercial and an open source ecosystem. Let me end with saying that Linux Foundation is really creating the greatest shared technology investment in history by enabling open source collaboration across companies, developers, and also users. And I'm going to end the talk here and see if there's any time for questions.